Okay, so we're going to go through and because people can upvote, you can do it in real time. You can also add in your new questions, and we'll try and get through as many questions as we can for anyone here on the panel. And so starting at the top here with top questions, and I know one or two of them we may have already gone through, so we'll just not go to those. But the first question is, what kinds of metrics would show our ultimate goals of new collaborations, new science, et cetera, as a result of data reuse? Anyone on the panel wants to answer that? Stephanie, do you have any thoughts on the first question?
Sure. I mean, this is all very speculative at the moment, I think, because we don't have that many studies yet that tell us about the different patterns of how data is used and cited, maybe. But if we follow what we know from bibliometrics, so like new collaborations or new science, which would be probably the like a new field or something like that popping up. We have indicators that show us how interdisciplinary a paper is, for example, on looking at how it connects two fields that have usually not been cited together or collaborated a lot. So that might be an indication if a data set is linked to or references other data sets from completely different disciplines. That might be a good indicator. But again, at this point, I'm really just speculating based on good practices or what I know from bibliometrics. So I think we need much more quantitative and qualitative research on this.
Anyone else on the panel want to add to that? Okay, it looks like the next question was one that we had originally asked. So jumping down one, the next question is, how important is metadata to the establishment, measurement, and use of primary data, sites, downloads, et cetera, metadata standards?
This is Valerie. I'd be happy to tackle that one a little bit, because at NCBI, we have large collections of data, and we see a really wide range in the quality of metadata that's associated with these data sets that come in. And in talking to our users, we hear how critical this metadata is for them to understand whether or not data is good and whether they should be using it. But it's also interesting that as submitters, they also recognize that sometimes the variability is, a consequence of how much information they put in their own submissions when they submit data to us. So I feel like the metadata is really important, and having standardized metadata enables us to make these sorts of comparisons between different data sets. And until we have that, it's going to be really challenging. And I feel like the community is really reaching a point where it's starting to understand the value of the metadata on the data sets that they put in. And so hopefully we're going to see that improve, but it's going to be, I think, a little bit of a lag and a challenge as we work to sort of bring the existing metadata up to standardized levels.
Completely agree with that. We've seen the importance of how we need publication dates and funders and the license of the data all to be documented as well. And so having that is a requirement for us to even have these metrics. Anyone else from the panel want to join in on this one? Great. So looking down to the next, again, I think the question for Mike Huerta, that was one that we answered for Stephanie. So the next one is, how can our public data archive, TCIA, get branded as data citation count approved? Are there criteria, data DOIs? We want to show solidarity. This is great, and DOIs are not required. It's essential that data always have a persistent identifier, but it's not required that we use DOIs for data usage and data citation. the code of practice for usage could be used on any access logs. Of course, if it's a moderated access, it's going to be a little bit different. But some ideas for how we could do this is, showing that you are using the counter code of practice for that. And then also for data citations, making sure that you're displaying them. Re3 Data is a registry of repositories and a great place where your repository can have that. Data citation and usage is a facet on there, and so that can be also included there. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that question? Okay, and also it was my mistake. We did not actually answer that first question that was asked for Stephanie. It was a different that we had asked her. So I don't know. Do we have, Stephanie, do you by chance remember what that question was and want to answer?
Yeah, so the question was for the relative citation ratio, the RCR, which was developed by the NIH. So I should have actually included it in my slides probably. So the really great thing about the relative citation ratio is that it is a field normalized citation ratio. So it's trying to compare citation impact of publications to what you would expect given on the field. However, there are a couple of problems with the ludo.org, and I actually just want to point to a blog post, and I linked to that on Twitter, that Ludo Waldman from the CWTS at Leiden University in the Netherlands has written, and he actually lists a couple of problematic properties of the RCR. So the first one, and the most problematic, is that theoretically the relative citation ratio of a paper might actually decrease when the paper gets more citations. And that is particularly so when it gets citations from an or from a field that it has previously not been cited by. So that means that publications may actually be penalized rather than rewarded for receiving interdisciplinary citations. And that's a huge issue. Like, you don't want with one more citation, usually want your citation rates to go up and not potentially go down. And then the other issue the indicator has is also that it uses journal citation rates to determine the field. It is the journals that it is usually a paper is co-cited with, but the journal level is kind of and could be an issue here. And then another critique that Ludo brought up in his blog post is also that the RCR or the authors actually show, yes, the RCR is very well correlated with reviewers' judgment, which is, I said in the beginning, that citation rate or scholarly metrics in general should complement peer review. So if the metric actually correlates with peer reviewers' judgment, that is great, because you kind of want it measured something similar, the same. The problem in the paper, though, was that although the RCR correlated well, it did actually not show if it outperformed or was doing better than other field normalized citation rates that already existed. So I'm talking about the average relative citations, the ACR, or at the Leiden University, CWTS calls it MNCS. So these field normalized citation rates that already exist have a couple of different names, but they're usually calculated the same way. So so the RCR actually has a number of issues that have been discussed in the bibliometric community already, and it doesn't solve really of what it wanted to solve, kind of, or the flaws that other indicators might have.
Thank you for going through that, and I see now the question is there. Moving on to the next question, someone posted, evaluation of data quality and scientific merit is not really in numbers. How is NCBI addressing that? Valerie?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Founded as an archive, it's sort of our mandate to take all data, regardless of quality within some, measure there. But we do spend a lot of time doing a curation of data as it comes in to ensure that it does meet some minimum level of quality. And as we're now trying to sort of move to maybe this more data economy where we're trying to understand how people are using the data that's in there, we're looking at not only ways of perhaps exposing to the larger public the various evaluations that we've done on the data and indicating, how did something fare, but also making those evaluation tools available to the public so that they can run themselves before even submitting the data in. Because it's always a challenge that, if someone submits data and it, through evaluation, doesn't look to be as great quality as something else, what is the impact to the submitter and their future funding if that were to be called out? So I think that's a whole new area that we have to be looking at. Because historically, it was just go ahead and put it in. And now with the data economy, we really need to understand what people are using. And it also is important to us because, storing data is not free, and nor is displaying it. And so being able to understand what the highest value data is informs the types of curation and markup that we do and how we expose it to users. So it's really just an area where we're really very actively working on making those evaluations more transparent and helping users do them themselves.
Dr. Redline or Dr. Burris, do you have anything to add to that? Okay, so dropping down a bit here, what incentives might help researchers compete collaboratively on insight from data instead of just competition about data ownership?
Yeah, hi, and this is Susan. This is something that we actually talk about a lot with our user community, and clearly, improving their citations, visibility, their own tools, if that tools are being used in their in the papers, are I think all good incentives. I think the other thing that people are sensitive to is even how they will present themselves in a competitive NIH grant, and being able to show that level of collaboration and openness in their progress reports, in their competitive renewals, and so forth. And then I think finally, I think the other big incentives are really identifying collaborative networks and even potential postdocs and trainees who get attracted to sort of the types of data that are being shared and wanting to learn more about the data owners.
Maybe if I can weigh in on that too. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, this is Valerie. Yeah, I was just going to say that to me, I think this is one of those areas where funding agencies have an opportunity to help incentivize the people producing data, because if collaborative use of the data is rewarded when applying for various types of grants or funding, that's one of the biggest carrots out there to make it happen.
The other thing that I did want to add that I alluded to before too is there is a cost for data sharing, and often that is not budgeted for or planned for, and so I think certainly I think not only can NIH and funders incentivize the reward people who allow their data to be leveraged for greater impact, but also plan to provide financial support to do whatever sort of harmonization or data organization or upload or whatever work is involved, or even the regulatory approvals, which can be onerous for some in some situations. So I think that's the other thing to really think about. I think at our end, we've also just thought about what we could do to kind of make the process as frictionless as possible. And so in fact, so you really minimize the amount of work the data user needs to do.
I also want to weigh in on the importance of the incentives. So as I kind of try to demonstrate in this either if you want to see it as a vicious circle or positive feedback loop, is that incentives and rewards are at the core of how researchers would behave. So I think we need kind of a culture change to increase the importance of the role of data, of research data, as one or a first class goalie output kind of, right? Right now it's more of a second class because it doesn't count for that much, or it's not as rewarded. So I think it's really like the role of that funders have is that they can be the one to bring this kind of cultural change about by certain policies or mandates. So I think it's one of the most important roles that funders can have. So if you look at what's happening right now in Europe with Plan S, right? Like this is a huge change happening there, and it is funders that is bringing that about.
So this is Regina Buros. I wanted to weigh in here too, because the whole idea of data as an asset that just reflects the level norm that across that data is perceived to be a resource for use by researchers, not something that you collected so you own. So for example, we fund within population health, we fund a number of studies where the data are resourced, the data collection is resourced, provides a resource for the field, and the data are released to the public at the same time that they are accessible to the researchers. There's no waiting period or anything like that that would convey the issue of ownership. And these are studies that we invest in because they provide sort of that resource for secondary analysis for other researchers.
Great. And before I go to the next question, I did want to remind, we got some questions about the slides and accessing them, and all slides will be available on the website after this, and that'll go out on Twitter and others so that people can access those slides. The next question that we have here is that easily available metrics get used, like H-index and journal impact factor. How will field-specific benchmarks for normalizations be calculated and made easily available?
So maybe I can take that one. So yeah, I emphasized that I think much of a popularity of or the use of an indicator is how it is available, and that's why even such flawed and problematic indicators like the H-index or the impact factor are so popular and so powerful in the tenure and promotion process and the academic career, is because you can like easily look them up, and especially the H-index, I think, owes its popularity to being included in all the major citation databases, right? Like if you look up some researcher's profile on Google Scholar or on Scopus or Web of Science, you always see the H-index. And so what can we do to foster or make data metrics? And I'm looking more, I guess, in the future of like 2 to 5 years ahead. How can we make sure that they can be used? So I think most importantly, we need metadata, as we said before, to kind of create meaningful metrics. So that starts with the publication date, as Daniela said, goes to the really important part of the field. Somebody mentioned mesh terms, which might be really interesting for the biomed field of determining what kind of patterns or field-specific patterns you might look for as a benchmark. I think we have to make all this metadata and information and the metric that can be generated from that openly available. So it needs to be open data to have these kind of indicators easily available without any kind of restrictions of proprietary databases, for example. So the journal impact factor is a product of now Clarivate, right, the Web of Science. So I think a really great example there is the Initiative for Open Citations, I4OC. So they're actually saying that they want publishers to make freely available the information of references and citations because that is data that belongs to the community. And you might be surprised that publishers like Elsevier, or you might not be surprised, I don't know, but that publishers like Elsevier say like, well, no, we're not sharing with you the information of what references a paper has and link it to the citations. We don't think this data belongs to the community, but we're selling it in the form of Scopus, right? So I think the initiative I4C, the Initiative for Open Citations, this is something that which we should look for and keep all this information of data citations open, and then generate metrics from that and make them as easily accessible.
Thank you. Does anyone else on the panel have anything to add for this question? Okay, so that looks like the next two questions are pretty related about journal data citations. The first being, how do we get journals to agree to a standardized data citation format? And the second being that I had mentioned publishers sometimes strip data citations, and is this available somewhere? So I can kick this off, and then if anyone wants to follow after that. I think there is a data citation format. It's what Scholix had put out and what Crossref had adopted. And there's many ways that you could do that, with a data citation being a mention, in a data statement in the methods section, or a formal reference. And so it's really less about there being one way, but more about us all advocating for publishers when they send their metadata to Crossref, which, as Stephanie just mentioned, I4OC, that's a similar initiative to get when publishers send their metadata to Crossref to have those references be open. This is saying when you send that metadata, make sure that you're actually saying something is a data citation. And so it's actually marked up as that. And so how we can see this, there are some examples. If you look at a data statement in an article and then you go and you look at the XML within Crossref, you can see that it's not actually there. And it's actually just because of not marking something up as that. And we have a bit more information about this on the makedatacount.org website. But really what we're trying to push is just not just having something in a data statement, but actually marking it up and giving it the proper attribution as a citation so that it can be discoverable on the other side and used in other initiatives and such. Does anyone else want to add on that? Okay, so it looks like the next question is, what is the best way to disentangle citation and other user behavior driven by current resources infrastructure versus behavior driven by intrinsic motivations? Maybe Stephanie, do you want to kick it off from your perspective?
This is an excellent question, and I don't think I'll be able to really answer it. But yeah, so maybe to go back to the diagram that I showed that we published, I think the link is also in the Google Doc. So looking at these kind of acts that we refer to in terms of user behavior that we capture to then turn into metrics. It's even so a lot of people speak about like citation in terms of peer-reviewed literature and then mentions online, which is more in the altmetrics direction. But I think that it's not so much citations versus the rest, but even a citation can be so different in terms of the motivations why somebody cites it, right? So even if you're not asking for the motivation, but just looking at the citation context, there have been a few great studies that looked at the full text of publications and looked at in what sentence or what citation context the paper is cited. And you see that somebody could just briefly in the lit review mention, oh, somebody else did this, while really going in without going into the content of the cited document, or could at the same time be referencing the paper over and over again for reusing the methods or comparing results and so on. So we at the moment just count them in the same way because they appear once in the reference list, even if you have been mentioned multiple times in the document versus just once. So there's like a lot of potential still in analyzing citation context, and I think the same goes for mentions online, for reuse of data sets and so on. So I think there's a huge kind of difference in terms of just using one variable of a data set versus basing your whole research on a previous data set and so on. So I think it's going to be really hard to disentangle like the meaning of different types of acts, and that is still like up to future research. Also, up to the fact of being full text actually being available to analyze citation context, and the same kind of goes for I guess reuse of data sets, right? So Daniela talked about the markup as well, but like if you think about the semantic web or linked open data, if you were able to kind of qualify the connection between items and then provide a little bit more context, what the motivation was, even just are you reusing something or quoting something in a positive or negative or neutral sense. But I think there's still so much room for improvement there.
Thank you for taking a stab at that question. It's a great question. Okay, so things are shifting, and a reminder to everyone, there's many questions that are being asked, and if you upvote them, then they'll pop up into this top queue here. So it looks like data granularity and multi-level of data aggregations was mentioned under data is difficult. Is there any work in the field on this? So this was something that I had mentioned in my slides as just different points of perspectives of data, but I don't know that there's I don't know what work in the field may be intended by in this question. When I was pointing that out, it was really to intend that that is a characteristic of data. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add to that. Otherwise, maybe someone can clarify their question and we can come back to it. Okay, so the next also looks like it's a comment from someone. That's a standardized way to reference data and articles will also help, which is true. We should be advocating for that. So it looks like the next question we have is, you mentioned that bibliometrics are balanced in a way by qualitative peer review. How does this work for data? Data peer review is ad hoc. Where is the balance? Stephanie, do you want to start on that?
So yeah, I think that's a really great question. And yes, ideally data metrics would only complement the qualitative review of the data set. I think this is like a completely new area that still needs a lot of work, because there's really no, or at least I don't know of many approaches yet how data peer review should be done. So there's a standard of how you should usually review for a journal, but then you just have a manuscript. So if we peer review data now, is that supposed to be separate from the publication of the data set? Should it be before? Should it be after? Should there be a peer-reviewed rubber stamp on this? What does that mean? And what would be the process of peer reviewing a whole data set? Should there be a list of statistics or processes that we should go through? Should there be should we be able to redo certain analysis or check how data was collected? So I think that's completely still the Wild West out there in terms of how data sets themselves could be peer reviewed.
Maybe the other speakers on the panel, do you have any experience with what peer review has looked like for the data sets in your data repositories and resources?
So this is Regina at the risk of...
So this is Valerie. I was just going to say, for us, we have data coming in.
Of bad sound. Okay.
Go ahead, Regina.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead because your sound is better.
All right, sorry, this is Valerie again. I was just saying, you know, for us having data coming in from so many different sites, I don't know that I can really talk about data peer review because we don't always know what goes on with the data, you know, prior to a publication or some other submission. But there is, you know, from the perspective of the repository, again, the evaluation that we do on some of the data that comes in. And as I was mentioning before, you know, exposing some of those evaluations that get done and making them available to the public is maybe one way to make that a little bit more structured so that people are running similar sets of evaluation tools on the data. And again, with such a wide variety of data types, there's going to be variability in how sort of normal or well that can be done. But you know, the other thing that we are starting to look at is just, you know, considering how we track usage and whether usage of the data in itself becomes sort of a review of the quality of it and feeding that back in.
Yeah, I would echo the usage comment. This is Regina. And then I would add that there is one level of peer review that occurs for studies that are funded to collect data. They're peer reviewed. But then as data sets are constructed later for publications and things like that, that raises these other questions. And the two things that come to mind tying in with what Valerie was saying, the issues of reproducibility. So, you know, people being able to access them and reproduce the results, and the documentation or metadata, and having, you know, good metadata standards so that people can understand, users can understand the data and what's there.
And this is Susan. I wanted to add to that as well. You know, basically overseeing a repository where there's really complex data, we've created, you know, our own pipelines that, you know, for looking at data quality, which I think is actually a very multi-layered issue. And I think I think to some extent, data quality, you know, relates to the extent to which the documentation is clear and easy to use and accurate, and, you know, again, relates to metadata and data dictionaries and the associated backups, to really the you know, to the extent to which the data has really been cleaned and, you know, stripped of really extreme, you know, at least flagged for anything that extraneous, erroneous, and so forth, to actually the value of the data, maybe its novelty or its, you know, the precision of the estimates, the, you know, et cetera. So it's really at many, many levels. I wanted to share, though, with the group that I think there is an issue related to sort of the you know, thinking about implementing data quality standards. And one of the issues that we come across is that some of the data that we share are actually available through other sources. They may be available through BioLink. They may be available through a study-specific coordinating center. And one of the issues that may come up is, in fact, if one group does, you know, some type of you know, data quality review, and which then ends up flagging or even changing that data set, there may be non-comparability of data in other resources, other sources where those data came from. You know, I think it's always, you know, really important to, you know, that gets at, you know, creating obviously a provenance and making sure that the intrinsic data is always available. But I did want to point out that, you know, part of data quality also might mean what you do, you know, even as a resource to potentially even clean up or flag potentially problematic data.
Thank you all for answering that. I did want to, it looks like the latest question, even though I'm supposed to be looking at the top ones, it's confusion over something I had said. So I just want to clarify. When I said DOIs aren't required, persistent identifiers are required. I'm acknowledging that the biomed community has been using accession numbers, handles, and other persistent identifiers. And so we want to make sure that when we're building out these frameworks, we're not relying only on one type of data identifier, which is the DOI. Looking back at these top questions, we have one: if the repository is open and does use registration, how to measure the user base? For maybe one of the panelists who has a repository with user registration, do you want to answer this?
This is Regina. I'll give it a shot. So that's a really good question, because I think there's a difference between the ideal user base and who the user base actually is. So I think one of the values of metrics is that they may make repositories be more reflective about who exactly is the user and who is the user base, and how they should broaden, how to broaden their target for base, to grow the base. If people, if they think that they're being that they're if they think that their product, if we think our product is going to be of interest to a certain group, but we don't have any users in that group, then we need to reevaluate what the potential base is.
In our repository, again, users, are all able to register, but then there's other access-specific issues in terms of, actually accessing data sets, downloading data sets, contributing to blogs, and so forth. So I think that there are, I think the user registration is a really poor metric, but I think actually some metrics that really reflect the actually access and use of data and or engagement in the community is much better.
Completely agree. Okay, so
sorry, I was just going to add to that and say that registration is useful for identifying members of various communities, which then can sort of serve as a proxy for understanding larger groups. But really, as was just mentioned, nothing really sort of gives you as much data as actually seeing, counts of clicks and downloads. And while an IP may not resolve to a particular individual, those start giving you, I think, a better sense of what the size of your user base is. And in some ways, you can do a little bit of geographic tracking to understand where folks are coming from and make some inferences about who that user base is as well.
So kind of related to this next question is, if the meaning of usage metrics depends on how relevant users are reached and use the data, what are approaches to estimating the size of the relevant target group? And I think this can be put in different terms. Of course, if it's a mediated access repository, maybe understanding the registrants for that repository makes sense. But in other cases, maybe this actually is referring to the size of the field. If folks want to take a stab at answering that.
I saw this more from a perspective of differentiating between user types. So this is something that we've seen a lot in the context of altmetrics, where the idea was, oh, maybe if we're using social media mentions, then we can measure societal impact because it will be the general public that tweets about science, and which turned out to be not entirely true. So like if we talk about differentiating between types of users, it would only work if we asked users to kind of self-identify, I guess. So like if you look at Mendeley reader counts, which are used as a type of altmetric, people that use Mendeley as a reference manager and store documents there, they are asked to self-identify in terms of what field they work in and also what career stage they're at. So doctoral students, postdocs, professors, and so on, librarians. So that might be a way, but you probably want to want to open things up. So then it might be if you allow anonymous downloads and so on, then it might be problematic to really measure how many people you have reached. So you have the same issue that you have with download statistics for papers. It could be with 10 downloads, it could be 10 different people. And that might even like spread the copy of the document. Like if a teacher is using it and teaching to a class of 100 students and so on. Or it might be the same person 10 times, right? So I think there's still room for, I think it's definitely a good question to think about this, because you want to make sure that the data that you produce is actually used by the people that you are targeting.
Yeah, I'll add that at NCBI we also pay attention to things like going to conferences, running surveys, doing interviews, and while it can be hard to estimate the overall community size, by doing sort of targeted outreach like that, we can learn about the ecosystems in which people are operating.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, that we shouldn't disregard, even if we can't do it all the time or monitor it live, that qualitative research is really important to know more about the types of use and the types of users.
Great. So the next one we see here is, in the development of data metrics, is it a big challenge that there are so many repositories? Does there need to be agreement? And I would kick that off by saying that there's not an issue with the number of repositories. The issue is that if we don't have some agreement amongst us, this is where things become incomparable. Not only because of the size of the repositories, but because of all the field differences that we're going to see amongst them. But even looking at just coming from the general data repository perspective, we've already seen how necessary it is that there is an agreement that as general repositories, we're going to be standardizing in the same way to normalize these numbers, displaying citations. Maybe others on the panel coming from a disciplinary perspective can answer as well.
Again, so this is Susan. I think it can be challenging, in terms of, first of all, the user understanding which data are truly unique across data repositories and not fooling themselves into thinking they have a number of independent observations, but yet are actually reusing data from different data repositories is number one. Number two is, I think, the issue of to make the most out of potentially unique data across repositories. Again, you would like to ensure that there is some, way to securely but appropriately link the data on, individuals to make the most use out of that. And that does require some challenges in understanding, that authentication, access, and linking procedures can, be made, be put in place that work across those data sets. And then, as I alluded to before too, is I think there is the potential challenge that if one repository is more aggressive in doing data cleaning or even re-representing data, that could create potentially inconsistencies across those data sets.
Wanted to add with the agreement and the repositories. I mean, I hate to toss out the term big data, but as we are sort of entering this era where we're getting more and more data, there are going to be more and more repositories. And so, yes, this comment that we need some sorts of agreements to enable evaluation across the different repositories is going to be really important. But we can also look back to some of the more historical agreements that have been created and maybe sort of learn from them. And, in the case of NCBI, we host GenBank, which is part of the INSDC, which also has partners in Europe and Japan. And, this consortium has been working for more than 20 years now to figure out how to standardize the type of data that it takes in. And also, because of that, it enables more sort of ability to examine data usage regardless of where the data was initially deposited.
Thanks, everyone. So it looks like this next question is specific for Dr. Redline. What are the challenges you've encountered with researchers contributing data, and how do you overcome them?
Before Susan jumps in, I'll just say that, from the NCBI perspective, we often see that, while researchers care very much about their data, they often don't always think about the impacts of marking it up well with good metadata and standardizing things, because it's sort of the deposition or the contribution of data sort of happens at the last step before publication, and everyone's just so excited to get their publication out that it can be a real challenge to make sure that that data is harmonized and clean and really, really nice. And so, overcoming that is, I think, the way we overcome that is by making sure that the people submitting data really recognize how important it is that their preparation of the data is to its reuse. And as we move towards data that see that they've done a really good job of prepping their data for contribution, will sort of reap the bigger reward in terms of reuse.
Susan, are you there on the line to be able to answer this?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
You can. Okay. I agree with those last comments, and wanted to divide the problem into data that have been collected in the past versus prospective data, or more recent and prospective data collection. So a lot of the challenges in data that may be legacy data or data collected before the Common Rule, or even before this big awareness of the need to structure data in some consistent ways, really does relate to, in some cases, finding the data, pulling the right data, and then actually organizing it with sort of a decent data dictionary that can actually be shared, as well as potentially de-identifying the data. There are some complex data that sometimes have embedded, identifying information that people really, need to take, really care in. I think the solution, as the prior person who was speaking is to actually think ahead of time. Think, when you start your data collection, to start with the idea that you're going to consent the individual to share data going forward, and that you're going to use, sort of acceptable or, stated, data dictionaries and metadata, and that you have processes in place to readily de-identify. So prospective data collection with those things in mind, both from a regulatory perspective and just a data organization, will help. But then what you get into is the more recently collected data are the concerns about data ownership. And that's the issue, that even though the data might be ready to be shared and there may not be regulatory or other logistical barriers, there's this sense like, not until I publish the next 20 papers will I share it. And that is really a cultural issue, as was really beautifully said earlier, that most of these data are actually funded by taxpayer dollars or other, philanthropy, and they really, we need to just, make it clear that that's not an option. And people, in terms of future funding, need to know that, that these data are really public resources and they're treasures.
Okay. This is Regina. This question made me think about the RFC, the NIH, on the policy for data management and sharing, where going forward, NIH, emphasizing again the prospective process, and how I think things will really change in the data sharing landscape in terms of repositories and the availability of data going forward, with the emphasis in the RFC and the plan on data management and sharing plans. So encouraging researchers to incorporate that planning prospectively going forward, I think, will really show us the rewards in the long run. we're still dealing with a lot of retrospective and a lot of culture change, but going forward, the emphasis on developing the data management and sharing plans and having these conversations now about metrics and how, what the best metrics are and how to qualitatively evaluate that, I think is really essential because that will inform these plans going forward.
Thank you. So we just have a couple of minutes left here, so I'm going to end on this last question at the top, but all of the panelists are able to answer on Twitter or other. We see all the questions that are coming in, so hopefully we can still answer all of these, put those answers in the Google Doc and others so that people have access to these. So for this last question here, what is the best way to combine the metrics from an online data resource and the publication to accurately represent the full impact? And I can kick that off by saying that I think that there's a couple of mechanisms here that are possible. So Scholix, as I mentioned, was a way where a protocol where repositories and articles can be representing and denoting these linkages between. And that's really relies on the foundational plumbing efforts of DataCite and Crossref to persistent identifier organizations. And without them, we really wouldn't be able to build on finding these and be able to pull back and see all of these relationships and linkages. And many of the commercial offerings are actually relying as well on Crossref and DataCite for these. So it's essential that we as a community support these infrastructure organizations. But for the non-DOIs for DataCite, we've also seen Europe PMC has invested in this by also being able to couple the data and the article and show that within their search as well. But maybe others, if you have other responses of how you've seen this work for non-DOI and other initiatives.
Yeah, this is Valerie. I was to say, I know this is really sort of an ongoing challenge for many people to combine, usage of the publication with usage of the data. And so I just really wanted to reiterate that I think this notion of sort of persistent identifiers for the data sets that can be tied to the publications is going to be the way that we need to move going forward in order to keep those two things in sync together. And it's definitely an area, like I said, at NCBI that we're starting to evaluate how we might be able to do that.
Any last thoughts from anyone else on the panel? Maybe any closing remarks that you didn't get to say while we have this last minute? All right, well, thank you so much to all of our opening speakers. It was a really wonderful conversation. We've driven so many questions that have come in, and it'll be interesting for us to all contribute to these answers and hear. There's so many people here on the call that probably work in this space as well, and we would love to hear your thoughts on them. So please, if you can enter your answers, your thoughts to the Google Doc or to the idea scale going forward, it'd be great to be able to capture your input on this. So thank you again to everyone who joined at the beginning. And I want to transfer now over to bring in my co-chair, Dr. Warren Kibbe. Warren is a vice chair and professor of biostatistics and bioinformatics at Duke University, and he's the chief data officer of the Duke Cancer Institute. Prior to moving to Duke, he was at NIH, where he was a proponent for open science and open data and biomedical research, and he helped define the data sharing policy for the NCI Cancer Moonshot program. He is also the co-founder of the Cancer Informatics for Cancer Centers Society, and we wanted to introduce Warren before taking our brief lunch break. Hello, Warren.
Great, thank you, Danielle. That was a very kind introduction. So can everybody hear me okay? Can you hear me? To double check, great. This afternoon, we're going to do a little bit of a shift. There was some discussion this morning about use cases, but a lot of it was really focused on what are the metrics for measuring data usage, how does it compare with citations, and of course, a lot of discussion about the limitations of the existing metrics and the interpretation of those metrics. This afternoon, we're going to look at it much more from a use case perspective. So asking, if you will, the question of why some of these data metrics will be useful, and doing that from different viewpoints. We have Sean Cody at NIH talking about using data metrics to measure return on investment from a funder standpoint. Rob Moritz at the Institute for Systems Biology talking about how data metrics can be used to tell the story of the value and impact for a particular repository, and how that's important for the repository to be able to get funding, which we all need to do. And then from Brian Bird on how the user community, it's researchers of all sorts and flavors, can use data metrics to identify repositories that are useful for them, and how those repositories can enhance the usage of themselves by giving the community access to the metrics that are of most value for those users. So that's what's on tap starting at 1 o'clock. In the meantime, and we will use the Slido mechanism this afternoon to capture questions, and then also have some polls available to find out how you all are thinking about the afternoon session. And you can also in the interim until 1 o'clock, both get some lunch, and then also go to the IdeaScale site and put in some of your ideas. The last thing I want to mention is we have been taking notes, and it's a collaborative opportunity to help us with note taking, and you can see the URL for taking notes both in the chat box and then on the page right now, and there's a bit.ly URL for it, and it's just NIH Data Metrics should take you to the right document to take notes. So with that, Daniela, that was a wonderful morning session. Thank you so much for running it, and to all the speakers for just doing a tremendous job this morning. And we'll try to do the same tremendous job this afternoon. So thank you everyone for participating this morning, and looking forward to continuing at 1. Thanks.